Shana Tova. I am a lover of numbers. Yes, the book of the Torah, but also statistics. And this year I am pleased, I even dare say proud, to report that an important number in my life has dropped by over 20%. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, my Erdish number has dropped from 5 to 4. That was not what you were expecting, Dave Cohen. In the world of mathematics, in the world of science, your Erdish number is a way of measuring how connected you are, whether you are an insider. And so this is really, and for those of you who were told there would be no math, don't worry, we're getting past it soon enough. This is a story about we can all, and how we all should be, connected with each other. And I think it's a message that is more important than ever on this Rosh Hashanah. Let me explain. Paul Erdish was one of the most prolific mathematicians of the 20th century. Now, there have been a lot of great mathematicians, Euler, you name it. But Erdish was unique in two ways. One was that his interest ranged over a much broader scope of topics than most others. The other is that he treasured connections with colleagues. So he wrote over 1,500 papers, which is nowhere near a record, but he co-authored those papers with over 500 other mathematicians. And so scholars in many fields took it as a badge of honor that they had written a paper with Erdish, or they had written a paper with someone who wrote a paper with Erdish. And so if you were one of the, and they actually came up with a game or a concept of an Erdish number, which was how closely you were connected with him based on whether you had co-authored a paper with someone who had worked with him. So if you were one of the 509 people who had worked directly with Erdish, then your number was 1. If you are one of the over 12,000 people who wrote a paper with one of his collaborators, then your number is 2. If you wrote a paper with one of them, then your number is 3. Now you may ask, what if you are Erdish himself? Well then, mathematicians have an answer for everything the number is. Your Erdish number would be 0, but only one person can have that number. For years, I thought my number was 5, which is not bad. By the way, the average for a working mathematician, which is apparently a thing, is between 4 and 5. And I will admit it was not a number that I thought about very often. And then my daughter took a class with a teacher who had an Erdish number of 1, which inspired me to go look again. And what do you know? As it turns out, my Erdish number was now 4, because I wrote a paper called Information Flow and Temporal Coding in Primate Pattern Vision, a bestseller, I assure you. One of my co-authors, Dr. John Hertz, worked with Pablo Sibani, who worked with Peter Salomon, who wrote a paper with the great Erdish himself. So, I don't know if I am king of the nerds, but I am certainly minor royalty. And I think, by the way, I might actually be tied. I looked into this. I think I am tied with a few other rabbis for the title of lowest Erdish number for a rabbi. And by the way, mathematics is not the only field that has this kind of game. You may have heard of a more popular game called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. So someone will name an actor, and the players will have to figure out how, if that actor was in a movie with Kevin Bacon, or in a movie with someone who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon, and so on. So for example, Julia Roberts was in a movie called Flatliners with Kevin Bacon, so she has 1 degree of Kevin Bacon. If you were in Ocean's 11 or 12, then therefore you have 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon. As for me, as a rabbi, I would rather not be too closely associated with bacon. I would certainly never mention the names of about 15 Kevin Bacon movies in a high holiday sermon. But there are rabbis who get a lot closer. So for example, my colleague Hillel Nori will tell you proudly that he was in the Cobra Kai series with Elizabeth Shue, who was in Hollow Man with, wait for it, tofu, because he's vegan. So leaving aside all of this connect trivia, I want to suggest that this idea of how we are connected has a very important meaning today. Rosh Hashanah, the birthday of the world. The story goes that 5,783 years ago today, there were just two human beings, and they knew each other quite well. Today, sometime in the next year, on God's green earth, there will be 8 billion people, and they will all be ahead of you in line for gas at Costco. Our tradition and modern genetics both agree that all human beings alive today are cousins. But in such a big world, how close can we really be with each other? Yeah, I might have a great Erdish number, but how close can a rabbi in Sandy Springs be to people around the world? Not just academics or actors, everyone. So based on my email, I am apparently only one hop away from any number of Nigerian princes. But what about an insurance agent in Missouri, a Tibetan monk, a soldier in Ukraine, a hunter-gatherer in the back forests of New Guinea? So in 1929, there was an author, Corinthi, who came up with a theory. The claim was that any two people in the world were connected by no more than 6 degrees of separation. There was a play, there was a movie. Different researchers have actually tried to prove this in different ways. So a psychology professor named Stanley Milgram, tried an experiment where he selected people in Kansas to try to get packages to someone they did not know in Boston, and on average it took about 5 attempts for the package to get there, which, by the way, is better than you would do if you mailed it today using the post office. So you would think with technology, with travel, that the people of the world are closer together than they have ever been. But you know what? In some ways, that's true. Facebook says that now the average number of links between two members of Facebook is 3 to 4 degrees of separation. And with planes and trains and automobiles, migration, tourism, and trade, more and more people have friends and families and coworkers in countries around the world. We've learned in the past few years that a disease that starts in one place can very quickly be in every place. At the same time, our world is growing more and more disconnected. Some countries have banned social networks or cut off the internet. Even without that, our own country is growing more and more disconnected. We may know people around town, across the country, but they are more and more likely to be people who have the same beliefs, to be people who have the same priorities that we do. We are less and less likely to be connected to people who don't watch the same news, to people who don't have the same views. I wonder, does it take more than 6 links to get from someone who stormed the Capitol to someone who took to the streets for Black Lives Matter? And even if we do have those connections, are we even willing to acknowledge them? And by the way, when we don't have those personal connections, those meaningful connections, we seek connectivity in less healthy ways. through conspiracy theories, and believing wild things can lead to terrible wrongs. The world, my friends, has actually stopped shrinking, and as a result, we are all a little bit smaller. But anyone can make a difference. This summer, part of the disruption of airline travel was that thousands and thousands of suitcases were separated from our owners. We were at Schiphol Airport, and the hallways were lined with luggage that will never make it home. Or actually, to be fair, we know where all lost luggage goes. It is an outlet in Alabama. By the way, I gave a sermon about that 3 years ago. No one remember what the sermon was about. I don't even remember what it's about. But people still, this week, were emailing me, where was that place in Alabama? I'm like, and yet, some of those bags were spared a trip out I-20 because a few good men and women took pictures of the luggage tags and posted them, trying to let people know where their things were. And through 6 or 5 or 4 or 3 degrees of connection, things were returned home. There's this Jewish value of Hashivat Avedut that says returning someone's lost object is a special blessing, a special gift. And so maybe it's not surprising that I heard even more of those stories amongst Jews. Each of us has the ability to make a difference. And so I think that's especially true for us as Jews. And that's where each of us here comes in, because each of us has the ability, if we choose, to bring the world a little bit closer. And sometimes it starts with something as small as a luggage tag. We Jews have always valued these interconnections. That's the reason our Torah is so full of begats. So, Abraham is presented to us as this lone figure. He and Sarah cross the river to enter a land where no one knows who they are, and they know no one. They don't know a single other Jew because there aren't any. They travel footloose across the ancient Middle East. They forge relationships with people of many nationalities, many different walks of life. Abraham knew a lot of people, though. He knew the folks back in the old country, but he spent time in Pharaoh's house. He saved the wicked people of Sodom. He met Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem. He understood the value of hospitality, whether it was opening his tent to greet 3 strangers, not knowing that they were there to tell Sarah she's having a baby. Or, we read this morning he made a large feast, welcoming the people of the nations to celebrate the birth of Isaac. We also read this morning how he worked to establish trust when it had broken down with the Philistines. When he needed to buy a grave for Sarah, he assumed that no one knew who he was. And yet the Hittites greeted him with awareness and respect. Of course, you are a prince in our land. There weren't a lot of people like that in the ancient world. There were great conquerors like Nebuchadnezzar, Shalmaneser, Sargon, Alexander the Great. They met a lot of people, but most of those meetings were on the battlefield, and their acquaintances were therefore short-lived. That understanding of connectedness continues throughout our history. We were exiled, but we maintained the fervent belief that no matter how we were scattered, we were one. And so people, 1,000 years ago, when most people did not know anything beyond the mud huts of their own village, Jews were sending letters to rabbis around the world, Rabbi, is this chicken kosher? Now, of course, by the time you got the letter back across the Mediterranean, the answer was largely irrelevant. And here's the kicker. Paul Erdish, that mathematician I'm 4 steps away from, was Jewish. He fled Hungary in 1938, while many of his family members died at the hands of the Nazis. He was not a religious Jew. Erdish was a proud agnostic. Or actually, it's fair to say that he had a complicated relationship with God. He was not sure if there was one, but if there was, he was mad about 2 things. One was that God was keeping all the good theorems for himself, and the other was that God was the one making all of his socks vanish. And while my personal theology may disagree from his in particular ways, that is also the best explanation I can come up for what happens in our laundry. But even his interest in math reflected that sense of connectedness. Many of his most famous works revolved around the question of, if you have a network, if you have points, single points that are joined together, how can you measure how linked they are? Are there points that are connected to all of them, to none of them? What does it mean to be connected? We Jews still value connection. During COVID, there was a game show called Who Knows One. Now, most of the time when you are watching a game show, Bob Barker and Pat Sajak leave you well enough alone. But this is a game show where the goal is to annoy other Jews while they're trying to have dinner. So the idea is that 2 millennial contestants are put on a Zoom on Facebook and invited to find a connection to a 3rd random millennial Jewish person based on very limited information, working their networks of friends. And so they'll be inviting people onto the Zoom, and I actually got called a couple of times myself, but shockingly enough, I apparently have a more active social life than many of the people who are playing, and everyone's like, come back to dinner. They can find this person without you. We Jews are very connected. There's a story of a Jewish guy who bumps into his non-Jewish friend, some diner in New Jersey, and after the usual pleasantries, the friends ask him, do you know a guy named David Goldfarb in Queens? Logic would say that you do. The Jew responds, that's so anti-Semitic of you. Do you assume that all Jews know each other? Well, do you know him? Well, of course I do. He's my cousin's roommate, but still that's not the point. And so in some ways, our Jewish world is always a mirror of what's going on in the larger world. If the larger world is growing more fragmented, so are we. You know, it is rare that the Jewish people have ever really been united. So 2,750 years ago, 10 tribes of the Jewish people were lost. They were exiled with Erdish's socks. No one knows where they went. The legend is that they were trapped on the other side of a river named Sambatyon. This mystic river, or you prefer a river wild, blocked their path because it only stopped flowing on Shabbat when they were not around or able to travel. So until the days of the Messiah, these 10 tribes are stuck there on the other side of the river, creating this gap between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora that fundamentally, mystically, could not be bridged. Well, you know what? There is still a gap. Jews in Israel, Jews in America can get back and forth more easily than ever. Thank you, Delta, for returning direct flights to Atlanta. But Jews in Israel know less and less about American Jews, and American Jews for whom the view out of a birthright bus is a great start, but doesn't create real comprehension. And so there are very few organizations that are really trying to make a difference. One of them is our Jewish Federation, bringing Shin Shanim to our community. So Israelis get to meet us and we get to meet them, having Israeli young people living in our homes. And also making sure we go there. One of the reasons that I'm participating in the 75th anniversary mission to Israel this summer with our Atlanta Jewish community, and I invite you to join me, is that I think it is important for American Jews to get to know Israeli Jews, and along the way, just as important to get to know each other. So you would think that our congregation, one community, might be different. And in a way, it is. When I came to B'nai Torah, it was a small, tightly knit community. Congregation, maybe 400 families, most of whom had already known each other for 2 decades. And we used to play a game called 6 Degrees of Don't Eat Bacon. As we were trying to get to know the congregation, I would start with person X, and then, get to their sister-in-law, then that sister-in-law's brother on the other side, who roomed with person X's cousin's husband at UGA, or you keep going and you get to that guy's business partner who's related to everybody in New Orleans, or you go another way, you get to everyone at Orvis Shalom. We also called the game, by the way, 6 Degrees of Joel Lebowski, just so you know. Those people are still here. But we're more than that. And you know what? We still care for each other. It's a much bigger web, and you know what? If you pull hard enough on one of the threads, the whole network still feels the tremors. This week, as many of you know, our congregation has been in the midst of 2 very challenging losses, and people are reaching out, offering sympathy, wanting to know how they can make a difference, how they can help. And what was amazing to me is, on the one hand, how many people said, I don't know these people, but I want to do something. My heart goes out. But the other thing that I'm surprised is that there are so many families in the congregation who have walked together, crossed paths outside the hall, stood in line at the bathroom, but never met. We have this incredible networks of friend groups, but those networks are sometimes held together by just one point, just one thread. Sometimes I'm that point, I'm that thread. I pride myself on knowing just about every member of this congregation. Sometimes I only recognize the top half of their face, but still. It means a lot to me to understand people's joys and oys. I can play the 6 Degrees of No Bacon game all day long. But what if I am not here on a particular day? What holds us together? We are a community of so many generations, from World War II veterans to Gen Z. Children go to Epstein, Davis, AJA, Weber, BT Lab. Our members have so many different levels of knowledge and observance. The members of our community are looking for so many different things. My father used to divide Jews into 2 categories: FDR Jews and JFK Jews. When I talk about FDR, I'm not talking about the Ken Burns documentary. FDR stands for davening reasons. The JFK Jews, just for kiddush. But by the way, I'm actually okay with that as long as you take your turn and sponsor every now and then. Because there are the people who are here to pray, and there are the people who are here to be with the people who are here to pray. Or maybe just because they heard there might be locks. It used to be that the high holidays were one common shared experience. It used to be that every member of the synagogue fit in this room with room left over. And then in 2008, we realized, wait a minute, if I can quote a movie that Kevin Bacon was not in, we're going to need a bigger boat. And so we had 2 services, then 3. At the moment, I believe there are 5 different services going on right now between here and Weber, Princeton Falls. That's amazing. And as soon as I'm done talking, they will all be in the line for the bathroom, but not the same bathroom. And so, as Rabbi Adler mentioned, that's why we hired a rabbi for engagement, to find the links, to find the hidden connections between people. We're relaunching a program called B'nai Bridges, bringing people together based on what they have in common. In some cases, those are people who are already linked. Moms of toddlers, new retirees, empty nesters, knitters, genealogy buffs, cancer survivors, parents of LGBTQ+ children, or people who just might not have otherwise. Those are the strings that turn the threads of our community, that weave us into a real fabric. And after the holidays, you'll be invited to participate. Join a group that's already in the pipeline, create a new one. And by the way, we're not asking you. I once asked some folks who were sitting at Kiddush, hey, there's a new person, would you mind letting them sit with you? And the response kind of caught me off guard. That's okay, Rabbi, we already have enough friends. So I'm not asking you to make a new best friend, but LinkedIn did some research that if you are looking for a job, for example, the most valuable connections are not the people in your own tight circle, but actually the people with whom you have a little less in common. Because the people who do everything you do know the same stuff that you do. The people who don't do the same stuff as you do know things that you don't. And so too in the larger world. You know, my best friends, for the most part, may always be the ones who go back the furthest, the ones with whom I have the most in common. Other rabbis, old roommates, fellow Mets fans. But sometimes I learn the most, I have the most amazing experiences with those people I am just getting to know. People where we might go out on a limb for each other, even though we don't yet have the whole story. And that's what a community is about. People who help each other, learn from each other, inspire each other, mourn together, celebrate together, even though they are not from the same small town in South Africa, even though they weren't in the same sorority at UGA. They have made a connection. We also know that in-person connections mean more than just the ones on the screen. Even though I'm glad that hundreds of people are watching, it's not the same thing as being there. That's why we've been moving the center of gravity of our services back to our synagogue and coming back on Wednesday to our Beit Midrash. And I know some of you are watching from home, you're worried about being in a crowd. I can assure you Monday night at 6:15, being in a big crowd is not going to be your problem here at Minyan. But by the way, having that opinion, having that opportunity to connect with and support people you haven't met can grow into something more. people who form the kinds of bonds that are created by faith. We've talked about the connectedness of the world, of our Jewish people, of our congregational community, but I want to remind you that there is another kind of connection, your connection to God. And so Pirkei Avot talks about an intellectual connection. Moses received the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, prophets to the men of the great assembly. And Shimon HaTzadik was the last of those men. And by the way, you can see his words on our yahrzeit board. And so keep on reading the chapters of Pirkei Avot forward, and you get to Hillel and Shammai, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Follow the books of our literature, and you get all the way to the present day. So instead of an Erdish number, you could compute, if you will, your Moses number. How many links is it from you to the giving of the Torah? If you do the math, sorry about the math, each generation is 25 years, so 4 links per century. If you calculate a Moses number that way, then my Moses number might be something like 130. It's kind of disappointing to have like an Erdish number of 4, a Moses number of 130. But by the way, there's another way to compute. Because the words of those who have passed on are still with us. So if you read our yahrzeit board, you have brought your Moses number down to 20. But by the way, you can do better, because all you need to do is open the Bible, and you too can have a Moses number of 1. One final number I need to talk about. It's not the how many minutes long this sermon number knows, which everyone always tells me is too high. Let me talk to you for a minute about your God number. There are some people, by the way, whose God number is 0. They believe in a higher power, but due to the amazing ability of ego, they think it is themselves. And then there are the people who believe that they can't connect to God themselves. They need an intermediary, another divine being, a rabbi. Rabbi, can you pray for me? They think the best they can do on their God number is 2. Well, in Judaism, we like to remind ourselves that God is 1, and your God number can be as well. So people, when they ask me, Rabbi, can you pray on my behalf? I say, look, I am happy to pray for you. I'm happy to put in a good word, but why don't I make the introduction and you can ask him yourself? All of us have the ability to make a difference. All of us have the ability to be the link. You can be the stitch that sews together the fabric of a community. You can be the thread that mends a tear in our community, in the larger world. You can connect with other Jews. You can help this community be a place that offers even more support, encouragement, inspiration. And you know what? If when you log on after the holiday, God is coming up on the list of people you may know, then think about saying yes. And by the way, you don't need me. Sorry. If you don't feel like you are connected with God, I'm happy to help, but you probably already have a friend request you just haven't opened. And if you are not sure, there are 2 ways to do it. One is to get to know other Jews. They'll be happy to introduce you. Or open the right book. You might have to write a book of numbers to get a good Erdish number, but open the book of Numbers, and your Moses number can be 1. Chag Sameach.